Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Giacomo, for that introduction. And it's great to be on this home turf of mine, back sort of locally, presenting on a topic that's very close to my heart. And I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to speak, because I was thrilled to be able to speak at this conference, especially with the theme that we have around breaking down silos. And and sort of rethinking language literacy through collaboration and care. I'm going to work at addressing this topic through addressing this theme through the topic, reaffirming heart and language education. I'm going to be critically reflecting on affect, agency, and community, these human dimensions in digital teaching. So let me just get to what we will focus on. So I'm going to initially start with discussing why heart. What is this notion of heart that I'm framing in this talk here around affect, community, and agency, and realizing that we really are in quite a pivotal moment in language education and education in general. So I'll talk about the factors that I think contribute to those. And I want to then talk about the affective dimension in digital approaches, and I will sort of look back at the experiences I've had in research and practice and look at some of the sort of situations and pedagogical moments that I've had that really made me reflect on affect and the affective dimension, these dimensions of affect, community, and agency. And then we'll look at where we are now, because the language education landscapes we're working in, as I'm sure you can appreciate, are pretty complex and getting more and more complex. And so I want to look at AI's role in this, sort of the elephant in the room, around how that is evolving. And then I'll share some lessons learned, and we'll end up talking about implications in teacher education, language teacher education, and research. So why this focus on heart? As I'm sure you all know, heart has always been central to what we do in language teaching. And we don't often think about it that way, because we really constantly work with issues like identity, language, ego, emotion, the psychosocial nature of teaching and learning. And language education is really all about relational work. And these are areas that we get very little training in. But it's the core really that connects sort of the nature of language teaching and learning. And this is why I think it's so important to talk about these things, certainly with digital tools, because they're often not sort of explored enough around sort of our new language education landscapes that we're working in. You know, and language education has always been about being, becoming, and belonging. And I think that's something that we must never forget. And we work in this area all the time. So what I've done here is I've sort of posed 3 questions I'd like us to look at in this talk that examine different dimensions of this human aspect of language teaching and learning that we work in. So the first question: how do we sustain heart and meaningful language learning in heightened discourses? Amid heightened discourses of automation, efficiency, and techno-solutionism. I'll talk about techno-solutionism as we go through this. So this is looking at the macro level, where we were confronted with this neoliberal, these techno-solutionist forces that push constant innovation and efficiency as unquestioned goals. And I think we really need to be critical of that on a regular basis. And then at the meso level, I'm inviting us to critically rethink how we design and mediate technology in ways to sustain connection, collaboration, and care. So this is the question: in an age of hyperconnection, how do we approach pedagogy that harnesses Gen AI and digital affordances while cultivating authentic presence and guarding against emotional disconnection? And then at the micro level, how do we as teachers continue to mobilize the human, empathy, authenticity, imperfection, moral reflection within these rapidly evolving learning ecosystems? Because at this level, as teachers, you know, how do we position and center the human in our rapidly evolving digital landscapes? And I think we've got a lot of noise that happens around automation and innovation. And it's how do we keep this human dimension present in these environments? Because I think it is so crucial. It's the nature, one of the unique affordances and dimensions of language teaching and learning. So we'll look at those dimensions as we go through this talk. Now I want to talk about these three areas that I've sort of highlighted as this human dimension, and we'll have a look at some definitions of affect, agency, and community, so we're all on the same page around this. So affect refers to the relationally emergent emotional attitudinal states, so enjoyment, anxiety, confidence, that shape and are shaped by pedagogy, social relations, and the broader learning ecology. So as Dr. Mercer noted yesterday, the presence of silos in our field has been pervasive. And as I expect you can appreciate, we often have marginalized and not really, and sort of dismissed affect in terms of language education and teaching and learning. So I think it's really important to think about that dimension because, there has been this effective turn in applied linguistics that's been happening over the past couple of decades. Meryl Swain, in her 2000 article examining the inseparability of cognition and emotion, said language learning is not just a cognitive struggle, it's a cognitive and emotional struggle. And in digital language education, scholars are increasingly stressing that affect is now a crucial area to explore. And I really do think that's starting to happen, although it has been sort of dwarfed by cognitive focus, these areas. So it is important to think about this. And when I was thinking about this talk, who knows Brene Brown? Anyone? Okay, yeah, a few of you. So she is a scholar in the field of vulnerability and shame who's done extensive research and writing on emotion. And I couldn't help but insert a quote from her that I think is pretty relevant. She says, "We like to think we're rational beings who occasionally have an emotion, but rather we are emotional feeling beings who on rare occasions think." Now, given the audience that I'm speaking to, I highly expect that you think more than that. But it does shed a certain perspective on the dimension, the crucial focus that we need to pay sort of towards affect in these and language teaching and learning and other areas that we work in. So agency really refers to the capacity of learners and teachers to act purposely within the perceived affordances and constraints of learning environments, a relational emergent process shaped by identity, interaction, and power dynamics. So as you can see, agency is deeply intertwined with affective factors like motivation, self-efficacy, emotional regulation. When learners feel empowered, they're more likely to engage emotionally and cognitively in the learning process. And agency is certainly shaped by users, tools, and the context. In terms of digital tools, agency is distributed across the human tool context system that's enacting a shared agency, a co-constructed agency of sorts. So I think it's important to think about that. And we'll explore that as we go through these discussions. Community is a relational presence and sense of belonging enacted in a learning environment sustained by participation, recognition, investment, and dialogic engagement. So the emotional dynamics and sense of community in a learning environment can influence who feels they belong and who feels they're marginalized. And this is really a crucial area and an area that we work in constantly as language educators. And as you can see, these three areas are really highly interrelated. So we'll examine those in these examples that I'll share in a moment. But I want to talk now about this pivotal moment that we're in, this really unique landscape that is somewhat overwhelming at times. Because these affective dimensions, I think, are key in helping us navigate this time that we're in. So let's have a look at some of the factors that are putting us in this crossroads right now with language teaching and learning. So I'm not sure if you can relate to the expression on this individual's face, but I'm sure we all feel this to some degree, this sense of overwhelm with what is happening in terms of AI sort of generated platforms that are emerging and evolving all the time, and just the rapidly evolving ecosystems that we're working in and trying to navigate. We're witnessing these continued breakthroughs around generative AI and immersive technologies, offering new possibilities that are exciting, offer engagement, personalization, the potential of learner and teacher agency. Yet these innovations have been raising concerns, and I've shared some clips from news items that have been very recent. We have the ongoing digital divide and the worrying effective and cognitive impact of some digital approaches that research is discovering around sort of affect that we have to pay attention to, and the urgent need for critical digital literacy in general in society that often isn't taken up, that often we as teachers end up having to take up to some degree in our classes that can be quite overwhelming. So there is this need to really build teacher capacity around this growing discourse of techno-solutionism, where people are increasingly, I don't know about you, but in my networks, people say, well, can't you just learn a language through Duolingo? Why do you need classes? Why do you need teachers? And I vent with them for another half hour, but it is something people talk about. And we're also in this increasingly polarized, fragmented socio-political landscape. There are funding issues that we're dealing with right now, visa caps, program reductions, and this increasing polarization and fear towards immigration, difference, and otherness that I think always affects the effective dimension in our classes, whether we like it or not, to varying degrees, obviously. But I think these dimensions we really have to look at in our teaching and learning environments. But I have relief because language education is quite transformative and has a real potential, unlike other content areas, really to be transformative. It has a power to help people connect, even in challenging times. It has the potential to foster empathy, intercultural, plurilingual understanding, critical digital literacies, to examine social justice issues while affirming identity, supporting well-being. So it really does have this unique humanistic dimension that really is expansive in a way and can sort of enlighten and build transformative skills that are transferable to so many different contexts. So I do think we are working in a unique area that has such potential in today's day and age. Now I'm gonna sort of take us back a little bit, and I'm gonna look back through some of the experiences I've had working with digital tools, and I'll share some experiences that have really illustrated to me some of these effective dimensions that are potentially exciting in terms of informing digital teaching and learning in today's age. So I want to, for us to have a look, excuse me. I'll start by talking about some of the benefits and limitations that were found in the days of early call. And this, is when some of you around may remember that we called the World Wide Web the internet, and when all of a sudden we could access loads of authentic resources. It was super exciting when we had access to these resources from all over the world. There was this sense of increased learner autonomy, individualized pathways that still exist today, different modalities that were introduced. So we all of a sudden had asynchronous modalities. So in a classroom, you could support interaction in an in-person classroom with asynchronous interaction that was self-paced, anywhere, anytime modalities. There was the potential of more egalitarian participation, certainly with social media. When Facebook started, it was touted. When Twitter started, it had the potential of individuals had a voice. You know, they all of a sudden had this audience, this voice that was really unique. Um, you know, so it was really quite exciting. Obviously, that's changed as we've seen, but it still has great potential for this more egalitarian participation. Multimodality, I mean, we can communicate in different modes. That was exciting. We could connect with communities, with classrooms around the world. This is where telecollaboration, virtual exchange arose, and such exciting potential with that. And as teachers, we could all of a sudden have reusable learning objects. You know, we could develop a course in one learning management system and reuse it, continually adapt it in another. So it was exciting in that way. The limitations, you know, there was a pervasive digital divide. And it's interesting, when I was looking at these benefits and limitations from the early days of CALL, I did realize that a lot of them haven't really changed. I mean, they're become more nuanced and morphed a bit, but still the themes are very similar to what they were. So I thought that was interesting to see and to share. You know, so we had these platform bandwidth issues that we still have to some degree. We had limited interactivity, authenticity, the drill and kill type of exercises that were used in the days of early CALL, computer assisted language learning. You know, and the need to build techno-pedagogical competence for teachers and for learners also. How do we learn online? We may be very adept at communicating using online tools, but how do I learn in this online learning environment? Lack of tech support, writing, training, compensation, and this focus in professional development on understanding what tools do. You know, so we go to workshops on smart boards, figure out how a smart board works, but not how to use it in my language teaching and learning context. So this is still a big area that is lacking, and that's why communities of practice, peer mentoring can be really useful. You know, and I'll share this quote that really resonated with me. This is one of a project I did over a decade ago now with the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and it was a provincially funded project to examine the feasibility VSL e-learning sort of integration in community-based Ontario classrooms. And this instructor said e-learning has the potential to change the texture of the classrooms by moving away from old stand up and teach models to a more engaged model where learners become designers of their own destiny. So again, this teacher all of a sudden recognized agency. These modalities were offering substantial agency that weren't offered in these face-to-face learning environments. So it was this potential. And this quote sort of echoed what administrators, learners, and other instructors were expressing in this study. You know, but this sort of illuminates the fact of the need to create a sort of presence in these environments and online environments. Has anyone heard of the community of inquiry framework? Yeah, so it's been around for a couple of decades, and it was really used to it was developed to really try to understand how do we create presence in online learning environments. And what was found is that there are three areas of presence: teaching presence, social presence, cognitive presence, and it was really the teacher's role in creating, sustaining social presence to some degree, cognitive presence. And you can see this quote at the bottom by the developers of the TESOL technology standards that were developed about 15 years ago to help teachers integrate technology in a whole range of EAL teaching contexts. So social presence is at the heart of creating an online learning community. The teacher's role is to set up structures and processes for successful learning environments. So it was really interesting in that regard to see, you know, that teachers really are key in setting up this environment and creating social and cognitive presence. And what I want to do now is I want to go back in time and talk a little bit about this very old technology that I use, discussion forum, that I'm sure many of you use now to support in-person or synchronous classes, an asynchronous modality. But it was really a transformative moment for me as a teacher when I was teaching in an EAP context, in a university context. And this more mature student I asked, tell us something about yourself. Who are you? So as an introductory activity. And I asked the student really to share, all the students to share something about themselves. So this student wrote quite an extensive narrative about where he was from in Chile. And if you just take a moment to review this, then we'll talk about some of the features that it offers. So you can see it's pretty powerful. Like no other student shared anything to this degree. Now, understandably, this is a student with a very unique life experience. But as you can see, this modality really gave the student the chance to curate and share a much more detailed dimension of themselves, something you'd unlikely never get in an in-person class. So this student perceived this narrative affordance with this asynchronous modality. They enacted this agency, negotiated his presence in this learning environment, worked with affect, and dramatically impacted the learning space within this class that I was teaching. Because once he shared this, students reacted and they said, wow, I remember hearing about Pinochet, or this is phenomenal. And what they did is they opened up and shared much more about themselves as a result. So it really did, sort of like a domino effect, it really did move them along and really created a learning community that was so connected that I'd never had such a learning community in my teaching career. So it was really dramatic. This one narrative that this student shared opened people up so much. So it was really an example of the impact of agency and affect on these learning environments. And obviously since those days of asynchronous discussion forums, we've had a lot of areas emerge in digital approaches that people have been researching and exploring pedagogically. So, multimodal identity texts are certainly used and analyzed these days as ways of students to present themselves in much more detail and much more depth in learning environments. Digital storytelling has certainly gained ground in this area. People are doing these telecollaborations, these virtual exchanges that have evolved to the nth degree, and I'll share some examples from that in a moment. Gamification, how digital gameplay can affect willingness to communicate. So these areas, social dimensions of telecollaboration, et cetera. So, it really is the field of technology mediated language teaching and learning is ripe for research and pedagogical practice in these areas. And it does interact with affect, but it really hasn't been studied. The affective dimension has not been studied a lot in these areas. So it really is something that needs to be explored. And I want to turn to some examples. I've participated in a couple of virtual exchanges in my career. And I did one with students in Toronto and Dubai, a transnational wiki writing project. So they were working with a wiki. It was fairly new at the time and pretty revolutionary. And then I did a project with master's students in applied linguistics and master's students of TESOL in the Middle East. So it was really quite an interesting, and they worked on collaborative lesson design and curriculum design. So I want to share, this was really a learning opportunity for me because these things didn't work the way I thought they'd work. And so it was really learning from sort of what we could do better. So I'll read a couple of these quotes because they're quite indicative of what was going on and the dimensions of affect that were being engaged. So this one student, Annie, she was an MA TESOL student in the Middle East, and she was communicating with working with a student in Toronto. And she said, I feel like perhaps my partner would have acted a bit differently towards me had he seen my face and heard me speak and understood, yes, I'm just entering teaching, but I'm a 35-year-old woman and with experience in a lot of areas. So you can see that she didn't feel connected. She didn't have the trust with her partner that she was working with in this telecollaboration. And then the wiki writing project, we have this Toronto student saying the wiki webpage gave me a nice opportunity to make friends with foreigners who improve English. This time I knew a Saudi Arabia boy whose name is Ahmed Darwish. He's very friendly and sympathetic. And as you can see, Ahmed interjected here afterwards and said, Barbie, I'm not Emirati, not Saudi, just as you were Chinese, not Taiwanese. So it's interesting in that regard. Um, and I love this quote at the bottom. Well, I sort of didn't love it when I first saw it, but it was really enlightening. What I extremely hated is that I've tried to connect my partner, but he did not respond. So you can see these disconnections that were happening, these issues around trust and just not engagement with each other. And I call this sort of the need to build identity investment in these online spaces. So really, we realized that in both these projects, we were quite rushed, which is typical often with virtual exchange. The schedules were different, the curricula was different. We had little time to plan together with these teachers. So there were a lot of constraining factors. We realized that we didn't have enough time to have students get to know each other and to really build this trust. And so this is this notion that I call identity investment. It also would have been useful if we planned with the students. If we'd said, okay, you're gonna be able to work with students in the Middle East, what would you like to focus on? And have them exercise some agency in that planning process. And we realized that would have likely made a big difference with trust also and with engagement in the project. But this identity investment, I think, is key and certainly transferable to a whole range of environments in online language teaching and learning. Because we need to build that trust in these online spaces, because when we meet in person, we exchange a lot more information than we do online, non-verbally, et cetera, and make these connections that really don't translate online. I'm going to talk now about a really unique experience, a distinct area that I investigated with a colleague of mine, Farhana Ahmed, who was at York and now at Conestoga College. And it's really looking at these sort of virtual reality environments, these hyper immersive environments. And what we did, we investigated the experiences and pedagogical insights from a key unique informant, from a unique key informant, rather, Corellia Condor, and you can see her avatar picture in the screen here. And she had been working in Second Life for about 10 years. And she was an early adopter of Second Life and used it in her French secondary school teaching in the UK. She taught also German in secondary school, and she learned Italian in Second Life with other teachers while she was doing all this. So that's a bit of a testament to the type of individual she was, but she was a very early adopter of Second Life. She loved it and she made a lot of connections there. But she really did express a lot of the effective affordances that were possible within these environments through these interviews that we did with her. So one activity that she really shared a lot about was a machinima. And this is a film that's done in a virtual reality environment. She worked with her teacher and other students learning Italian, and they did developed this play called The Hairdresser's Husband. She worked with these students to create, to write, to star in this film, all using Italian. And the film was prepared, has anyone done anything in Second Life? I know it's a bit dated now. Yes. Okay, a couple of people. Yeah, so it's a virtual reality environment that anyone can go in. So you can be working in there and someone can walk by and just engage with you all of a sudden. But it really was interesting because a colleague of one of the teachers just walked by when the students were developing and planning this, and engaged with them, asked what they were doing, and said, yeah, I'll play a role. I'll play a role in this play. So all of a sudden there was this unique, spontaneous dimension of this outsider coming in to work with these students. And the students worked in small groups in sound parcels where the teacher would drop in, and this was really interesting. The teacher would actually drop in and give them corrective feedback using a tablet and write down, say, this is what you were saying. What do you think about this? And she'd correct the form of the language they were working on in these environments. So it was quite wild. I mean, in Second Life, in these virtual environments, you can transport yourself all over the place. So it was just easy for her to drop in on these groups randomly and just focus on certain elements of the language. And the students eventually filmed this play and then watched it at this mock Academy Award screening that they all went to. They got dressed up, went to, and then went out partying after in Second Life in their avatar selves. so, so it really, I mean, it sounds wild, but it really is an example of these virtual reality environments and the potential they do have, the agency that's enacted in meaning and form, you know, the affective dimension around this with action-oriented elements where students are really designing these activities, solving problems, making decisions around them. And Cornelia said that it was one of the most memorable experiences she's had in language sort of teaching and learning. And it really exemplified this embodied learning in these environments that are possible with virtual reality and augmented reality. You know, she said, and it's interesting because she did reiterate the benefits of emotion in learning, you know, which is not surprising because when we're emotionally super engaged in something, then things stick. And she said, yeah, when stuff is happening, it sticks. Even if we're having major tech problems, you know, that it does make an impact. And she said, you've got to give students a reason to talk. If you feel immersed, you feel engaged, especially if there's some sort of emotion involved, then learning's more memorable. She used it in her French classes by projecting on the screen her interactions in Second Life with other colleagues who were French speaking. They did various activities and they'd project them so students wouldn't have to go into Second Life, but they could participate sort of observing it and engage that way. And she said, I've never had such fantastic results. I know I can't put it down that one lesson. She was talking about a lesson they were doing where they were looking at rental apartments in France. But she said it did seem to capture their imagination. So it really is pretty wild what she was doing. The final example of research that I'll share from my past really is this pre-pandemic work that we did, a group of us in SSHRC-funded research looking at what digital approaches were being used in EAP contexts across North America. And it was interesting because again, we had teachers talking about the agency that students have when they use these digital tools. So we had this teacher say, of all the benefits of technology in language, of all the benefits technology in the language classroom can provide, I think creating opportunities for students to take learning into their own hands is one of the primary benefits. Then we had, it was interesting because a lot of the teachers, students, and administrators were highly critical of technology at that point. This is 2019. 20, so right before the pandemic. And we had a teacher say, example, collaboration in my class is a result of my task design, not the technology. Just as technology can enhance our personal lives, it can enhance teaching and learning, but only in the hands of a thoughtful instructor. A bad worksheet on a screen is still a bad worksheet. So, you know, so giving that need for this critical digital literacy. But it was interesting to see that degree of criticality that really was new to me. I hadn't seen that before because, you know, people had often been overwhelmed with the wow factor from technology. And then, as we all know, in March 2020, the pandemic hit, and then we were in these lockdowns. And this is where digital approaches soared, whether you liked it or not. They often, sometimes were very bad how they transpired, but it threw teachers and learners into the digital age, whether we liked it or not. So over those 2 years, it really did teach us incredible lessons about the need for affect and really to focus on these dimensions. we were reminded that you can't rush online design, and that there was this heightened awareness of the psychosocial affective dimension of online language learning. There was the introduction to Zoom fatigue that really a lot of us were feeling. And even though video conferencing was amazing and really valuable during the pandemic, it did have this sterility around it, this curated sense of connection, and the awkward turn taking, et cetera, that happened. So it did sort of, enlighten us to some of the effective limitations with online tools. But, what was really surprising to me was when I went back into the classroom, I all of a sudden resaw the in-person classroom differently. I thought, wow, I've forgotten what that was like. And, obviously we'd taken it for granted. It was just normal. We didn't see these things were invisible. But a huge lesson for many of us, I think, was re-seeing how in-person interaction works, and everything seemed new in the classroom. So I think, the nonverbal communication, the value experiencing human presence, the awkwardness of vulnerabilities that people were showing in these in-person spaces, all of a sudden became connecting of sorts, and really shed a different light on the relevance of in-person learning that was somewhat invisible before. So, in today's world, as digital tools are now embedded in how we communicate. Our education systems, they become largely invisible in many ways. We no longer often talk about classrooms, we talk about ecosystems. And these environments are increasingly flexible and porous, with hybrid learning happening, high flex learning in and out of formal learning is happening. So students are learning stuff outside that they bring into the class quite readily. And I think one of the biggest challenges is the changing roles of teachers. The shifting roles of teachers and learners within these environments, certainly with Gen AI that we'll talk about now. So what I'm going to do with AI, because it is so new, I've had a look at the literature, and this is part of research that I'm working on right now. But I'm going to look at AI's impact in these three areas, these three constructs that we've been looking at: sort of affect, agency, and community. And the research is saying, in terms of affect, that there is incredible potential with AI tools. There's this feedback immediacy, engagement, motivation, a sense of voice that can happen, increased curiosity. AI can create these non-judgmental practice spaces that are quite informed, quite revolutionary in many ways. But some of the concerns are that the outsourcing of meaning making can happen. So we outsource making meaning to a tool, versus trying to figure it out on ourselves. And this over-reliance on that may fuel emotional distancing, build dependency. Sherry Turkle, who I listen to quite a lot, she's a scholar at MIT who's done work in psychology and digital approaches. She warns of artificial intimacy and pretend empathy. She says AI may stimulate empathy, but it lacks the emotional depth and moral presence of human care, as we understand. But sometimes it's hard when you're interacting with ChatGPT, Perplexity, or Copilot. You do have this interaction with this tool, and it sort of has a human feel to it to some degree, but it is this sort of performative, programmed dimension of it. And Sarah Mercer's work really supports this, because she talks about real engagement requiring vulnerability, something that AI can't do or can't demonstrate. So, the impact on agency, research is showing that the agentive potential of AI tools with both learners and teachers are impressive, but really when used in a critical manner. Because critical literacies can empower learners and teachers to constructively expand machine-human forms of agency, and it can be a catalyst for the co-creation, enhancing autonomy, There was a presentation I attended yesterday here that I thought was quite transformative and quite enlightening around these positive developments around AI. But it can, concerns are emerging around the passivity and de-skilling that these tools may be sort of facilitating. Issues around academic integrity, critical thinking, cognition. Learners may cede decision-making to AI, given pressures in learning performance grades, et cetera. It depends on the context largely, because, if we're dependent on getting a good grade and have little time, then we may just move to using AI as a resource. And as we know, these tools are replete with biases, linguistic, cultural representation biases based on training data. They give a superficial sense of autonomy that can inherently both limit learner and teacher agency in some ways. AI can have a positive impact on notions of community because it can help lower barriers, open entry points for students into the community. It can scaffold participation in the social life of learning, but it cannot substitute for the social life itself. And a thought-provoking quote by Sherry Turkle, again, she says, the trouble is when we seek out relationships of no vulnerability. We forget that vulnerability is really where empathy is born. And I call this pretend empathy because the machine they are talking to does not empathize with them. It does not care about them. There's nobody home. And that really is a concern when we start to define what human empathy is, what machine relationships are based on what machines can provide. So she is really talking from that dimension. And it's interesting sort of following her because she was really an enthusiast around technology, but she's become much more critical in recent years around this. So while AI does offer some affordances, it demands a critical stance when used to support the effective dimensions of language education. So let's now have a look. I'll share some of these lessons that I've learned when doing this analysis and some things that resonated with me beforehand. We really need to center the human and not lose these dimensions of who we are at the center of language teaching and learning. Trust emerges from presence that's designed, not assumed. Critical techno-pedagogical competence is key to critically leverage AI and other digital and in-person approaches to meet the needs of our context learners. Agency can be fostered by sense of control, critical digital literacy, choices, pathways, but we need to reflect on our assumptions, and we can't presume access to digital literacy, online learning strategies. And what it does really show me is that teachers are critical in this area. That we really need to work with these tools critically to create the affordances that they can potentially offer. And I do want to share a very relevant, informative article by my colleague, Dr. Anwar Ahmed, who's right at the back there from UBC. He can answer any questions on this. That affordances are not fixed properties of tools, but emerge from relationships between users and their environments. Digital tools may enable or constrain emotional engagement depending on how they're used or perceived. He proposes this notion of critical effective literacy as a pedagogical tool with the hope that educators critically assess digital tools like Gen AI to examine how these tools can affect learners' cognitive emotional development. And I think this is an area that I think is really warranted when we're designing and working with these digital spaces in language education. So we'll come back to this in a moment. I want to talk about some implications around language teacher education as we wrap up here. So I think we need to move from digital skills alone to this notion of critical digital agency and critical effective literacy, because I think combining these can help humanize tech use, help teachers design emotionally responsive AI pedagogies, ethical integration, et cetera. We need teacher-driven AI pedagogical content knowledge through peer mentoring, communities of practice, that really can be, I think, quite key with talking about the pedagogical means in which we can use these tools. And I think these two recommendations on the right side of your screen are really crucial in today's age. Building a critical reflective practice, examining self-efficacy, resilience, adaptability, and collective agency. I think collective agency is something we don't often think about in teacher education, but I think it is really key to introduce teachers to working with others because, as we know, teaching is quite an isolating profession. We do it on our own. We're not often interacting with teachers, other teachers, colleagues in our classes. I think this need to connect with others can be quite supportive in this environment. And, you know, as Sarah Mercer talked about yesterday, I think we need to really focus on introducing concepts of teacher well-being in programs, teacher education. And mindfulness is certainly an area that's been emerging within teacher education. And I think that can certainly support teacher well-being in many ways. But it is an area that I think does need to be integrated into TESOL, into language teacher ed programs, you know, to help us manage and navigate these context that we're in right now. And we mustn't forget the need for institutional professional association support. You know, we have substantial, great professional associations that support us through our work. And at an institutional level, we need sort of teacher and learner driven AI guidelines, because I'm not sure about you, but very few universities, very few colleges have guidelines that really support the use of AI in classes. So it can be lacking in that manner. We need to really, you know, support teacher agency and compensation and PD, you know, and these are areas that have always been lacking in language teacher education, but there really are areas of advocacy that I think is needed because, you know, integrating these tools takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work. Often teachers, we do it on our own voluntarily, but I think this does need to change. In terms of research, I think we need to really look at the effective scope, look at the effective dimension in digital technology, media, language teaching and learning approaches. So really having a look at the effective dimension within these emerging learning environments with AI and other tools. And we really need teacher and language teacher education directed research. I think that is quite crucial. And, you know, we also would be beneficial to look cross-sector and look at what's happening in other areas of education. And in terms of plurilingual research, you know, studies examining less taught languages, minority languages, language revitalization, and what AI tools do in those areas, because it can be quite substantial and the potential can be quite different. The affordances can be quite different. So I'm just going to share some research work that's being done in these areas right now. Some of you may have attended Enrique Picardo and team's presentations yesterday, the Advancing Agency in Language Education project. That's a great example of language teacher capacity building with this online toolkit that's emerging that will help teachers really work with pedagogical innovation that includes action orientation, plurilingual approaches through the modality of technology. You know, and I've been fortunate enough to work with two students whose work really resonates with the topic that we're discussing here. So Dr. Hiba Ibrahim recently defended her doctoral research, and she investigated the experience of students in a virtual exchange in Jordan and Toronto that examines factors that influence engagement, how these students develop community with each other, and how these experiences contributed to evolving understanding of intercultural competence in digital spaces. And Jose Luis Ortiz Soria is looking at sort of complex language learning ecosystems, examining the integration of AI and post-secondary EAP contexts, and really also looking at how learners take learning beyond the classroom and how that can inform in person or in classroom teaching and learning environment. So stay tuned for more findings to be shared from those studies because they are quite informative. A colleague of mine, Farhana Ahmed, that I mentioned before, who works at Conestoga, she and I were fortunate enough to get a grant to look at teacher and student uses and beliefs toward Gen AI and post-secondary EAP programs. So we're excited to be starting that, and we'll be sharing sort of findings as they emerge through that. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Antonella Vallejo, and I are examining the need to rethink English language teacher education in the age of Gen AI. So we're coming out with a volume on that. Once we get a publisher, we'll circulate a call, but that is something to think about if any of you are interested in contributing to that. I want to now wrap up by just reimagining some of these dimensions, these constructs that we've been looking at. So affect, how do we mindfully co-construct affect, the affective dimension, across human-machine landscapes with AI tools? And how do we support the development of agency critically and ethically within these complex learning ecosystems? Community becomes an ethical practice of relationality. How do we enact community across these hybrid ecologies through collaboration and care? And I'm going to end just with two quotes here. This is a quote that arose in the early study that I talked about, the ESL e-learning feasibility study with the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and the student poignantly said that we need to keep the human feel in the class. The teacher is very important in motivating me and helping me learn. And that really, I think, is something that can inform how we work today also, because I think it's, students often say, well, I want the teacher to help me with this. I really need this support. And we are in this pivotal moment. We're in an exciting age of digital tools and working with learner-teacher agency and notions of community. But I think it's really how we use these tools that's our responsibility. It's an invitation to rethink what language learning and teaching is. And this is from a quote that's a presenter shared yesterday that I've sort of added to here. But I think it's really relevant that it's really up to us, our collective responsibility to engage with these tools to really rethink how we do things in language teaching and learning. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.